The biggest scandal in Dream of the Red Chamber is a sex scandal. A man named Jia Zhen forces his daughter-in-law Qin Keqing into a sexual situation against her will. He uses her and then he treats her cruelly afterwards. And the event leads to her falling into despair, culminating in Qin Keqing taking her own life. But the thing is that the scandal I'm talking about here is not this story. No, the scandal is the fact that this story actually is not in the original text. And this is where things get a little bit weird, so let's dive in. First things first, as you may or may not know, I've been doing a full retranslation of Dream of the Red Chamber into English. This means going back to the original edition, published in 1792, digging through everything and figuring out what's going on with this book. Now, if you're not familiar with it, Dream of the Red Chamber is the most popular and notorious of the classic novels of Imperial China. Even though it was first published in the 18th century, it's got a very modern feel to it, largely because of its emphasis on realistic and complex character development. Now, as you probably already know, there are already other English translations of this novel out there. In fact, there are two major translations that are pretty famous, but there's just one problem with them. They both really suck. The Story of the Stone, translated by David Hawkes, is the version that most literary scholars prefer. This is because Hawkes deliberately translated it into the style of 19th century English literature, think Jane Austen, even though this work was published in the 1970s and 1980s. The problem, however, is that Hawkes inserted a lot of his own interpretation into his translation and completely eliminated some things in other places. Now, David Hawkes did do some things right, sure, but he also did a lot of things incorrectly, and it really gives me a headache when people talk endlessly about how wonderful his translation is. In fact, there's a book out there that praises him to the extent where it says that he's the only person who could ever translate this book into English or something like that. Yeah, it really stinks to high heaven. Anyway, if you compare the book to the Chinese original, you will realize quickly, early on, that there are a lot of issues with his translation, and it's about time that people call them out. Anyway, the other popular English translation is A Dream of Red Mansions by Gladys Yang and Yang Xianyi. This 3-volume set was published in Beijing in 1978, and the story behind it is pretty interesting. It turns out that the Yangs were victims of violence during the Cultural Revolution, largely because Gladys was a white woman from Texas, but they preserved and stayed in China and survived that dark time. The translation has nice illustrations, sure, but the text itself is not great. It's honestly more a paraphrasing of the original than an actual translation. And the problem is that most people who are interested in literature who want to study this book cannot read Chinese, and that's where my version comes along. My translation exists entirely on the internet at this point and is a translation in progress. As of the filming of this video, I'm about halfway through chapter 13. In addition to the translation itself, I also provide the full Chinese text, including scans from the original 1792 printed edition. And I've also thrown in a lot of translation notes for good measure and to help you if you're reading this in Chinese. So over on my blog, I put out 2 free posts a week. There's one translation text and one commentary for free. So the way that it works is that I alternate between each day. There's translation, commentary, translation, commentary. And if you want to read the whole thing, it's the grand price of $5 a month. Pretty cheap, huh? So go check it out over at redchamber.blog. The link is in the description. Anyway, the reason why I bring all of this up is because, as I said, there is a massive scandal at the heart of this novel. But the actual nature of this scandal is not entirely clear. And the 2 major English translations will not give you very many hints as to what's really going on. As I mentioned earlier, the television version of Dream of the Red Chamber from 1987 makes it clear that Qin Keqing took her own life after being raped by her father-in-law. The book, however, talks a lot about Qin Keqing being sick with some sort of mysterious illness. Qin Keqing seems to foretell her own demise as she lies on her deathbed, unable to cope with the emotional toll of what has happened to her. Now, the book does talk about her father-in-law taking advantage of her, but it's pretty subtle. In fact, this is so subtle that you kind of already have to know what's happening to understand these subtle references. In other words, if you were just reading this book in Chinese for the first time, like let's say you're a native speaker of Chinese, you've heard about this book, you decide to read it, and if you didn't know what certain terms actually meant, you would be completely lost, and I'll show you. There's this incident in chapter 7 where Qin Keqing invites Wang Xifeng over to visit. Zhao Baoyu winds up meeting Qin Keqing's younger brother, Qin Zhong, and Zhao Baoyu falls in love with him. And I'm not kidding, by the way. Now, I know that you're probably used to European fiction with a Christian background from like the 19th century, maybe 18th century. Well, here, Jia Baoyu is clearly infatuated with the brother of Qin Keqing, who counts actually as a distant relative of his. She's married to one of his distant cousins in the house across the street. We read a lot in the book about Jia Baoyu flirting really openly with Qin Zhong here, which means that we miss whatever conversation it was that Wang Xifeng had with Qin Keqing. My guess is that the conversation between the two women likely had something to do with Qin Keqing being raped by her father-in-law. Anyway, when Jia Baoyu and Wang Xifeng are finally getting ready to leave, a servant of Qin Keqing's household named Zhao Da starts screaming like mad, referring directly to this scandalous relationship. Now, that 1987 TV version does a pretty good job of representing this scene, though it skips over the most scandalous part. But of course, we can talk about this openly in this video. The servant Zhao Da specifically says the word pa hui, which technically means something like scratching in the ashes, something that even an advanced student of Chinese would have a hard time understanding. It turns out that this is a specialized euphemism for a man having sex with his daughter-in-law. Specifically, this phrase comes from a book called Jin Ping Mei, The Plum in the Golden Vase, which is the most notorious novel in Chinese literary history. Alright, so The Plum in the Golden Vase would be considered pornography if it weren't already considered to be, like a great work of fiction. It's just one of those books that defies all of the censors. So technically, that book counts as a great work of art, and it's got fascinating characters and a lot of really subtle meaning. But on the surface, it's nothing more than one crazy sexual escapade after another, and I really mean crazy and I really mean sexual. As for Cao Xueqin, the man who wrote Dream of the Red Chamber, he knew exactly what he was doing by using that word, and he knew exactly where the word came from. In particular, he knew that if he used that term, he would hide the true relationship between Qin Keqing and her father-in-law, Jia Zhen. Now, when it comes to Qin Keqing's funeral, it becomes obvious early on that there's something really strange going on here. Jia Zhen arranges an incredibly ostentatious funeral for his daughter-in-law, and honestly, the television version just does not do this justice. Jia Zhen winds up using extremely expensive and extravagant wood for her casket, the sort of thing that's normally reserved only for imperial use. Jia Zhen also asked for official government help in arranging the date for her funeral as if she were a major figure of state, even though she's really just his daughter-in-law and has no claim at all to any governmental title or importance. He has a group of 108 monks chant something called the Great Compassion Repentance for 49 days, ostensibly for her salvation, though it's not clear what great sin she has to repent of. And to make things equal, he also has a group of 99 Taoist priests do penance for 19 days to resolve grievances and cleanse karmic sins. This is expensive, of course. Now, the family does have money, like tons of it, but it doesn't really have income. The money is slowly dribbling away. But the thing is that ordinary women in the family don't receive this kind of lavish respect and honor when they die. In fact, most of the men don't. Actually, it seems that Jia Zhen is really trying to use these religious rituals to try to cover up his own sins, in particular, his sin against his daughter-in-law. Think of King David and Bathsheba in the Hebrew Bible. There are rumors, of course, that this has been covered up in the text, and we're going to get into this textual criticism, so fasten your seatbelts. Okay, I mentioned a little bit earlier the 1792 edition of Dream of the Red Chamber, which is the text that is most commonly used. This is called the Chengyi Ben. This is actually the second edition of this book. There was another one printed in 1791. The 1791 edition is called the Chengjia Ben and is similar to the Chengyi Ben, but it's not really the earliest version we have. So starting with the famous scholar Hu Shi in the 1920s, scholars began discovering old handwritten manuscripts of Dream of the Red Chamber, including manuscripts dating back to the early 1760s. Now thankfully, a lot of these have been typed up and color-coded to distinguish the different editing notes. This is something that helps us greatly in understanding just how this book was put together. Alright, so you see, Cao Xueqin did not just lock himself up in his thatched hut and write the whole book just by himself with no help. No, he didn't do that. He used editors. Just like if you're a modern author, you really need to have an editor, a proofreader, and stuff like that. And this is where the controversy behind this section in this book really explodes. So in this part of the older version of chapter 13, Zhi Jai, the famous commentator, tells Cao Xueqin that his reference to the suicide of Qin Keqing's maid mentions an earlier part that was deleted. Similarly, when the novel describes Jia Zhen setting up Taoist priests to beg for forgiveness at the Tower of Celestial Fragrance, Jia Zhen remarks that this is another trace of an earlier part that was deleted. And then there's a part of this commentary that specifically mentions the original title of the chapter as well as the truth of Qin Keqing's death. That would be this note at the end of the chapter. This is where the commentator, Jia Zhen, claims that he ordered the text to be altered. The original title was Qin Keqing dies wantonly at the Tower of Celestial Fragrance. And this part right here is where he claims to have given the order to the author, Cao Xueqin, to remove the reference. Now, most of the commentators have taken all of this at face value, and I'll show you where that leads you logically. In his commentary, David Hawkes claims that the deleted portion took up 8 or 9 pages and that it was originally removed because it was too upsetting to the reader. Hawkes goes on to note that Cao Xueqin didn't do a good job of removing these references. That reference to the suicide of Qin Keqing's maid, for example, stayed in the final text. The same is true of that reference to the Tower of Celestial Fragrance that I just showed you, so apparently Jia Zhen's orders were not all that powerful. Anyway, Hawkes goes on to speculate that Jia Zhen might have been Cao Xueqin's father, and that the whole thing referred to some family sexual scandal that he wanted to cover up. The thing is, though, that there's a major problem with this interpretation, and this problem goes back to chapter 5 of the book. And this is where the textual criticism of Dream of the Red Chamber really becomes a lot of fun. Chapter 5 of Dream of the Red Chamber is filled with these predictive poems. These can be really frustrating to read, especially if it's your first time going through the book. They last forever, and the poems only start to make sense once you've read the book and understand the language and logic of the novel. Qin Keqing counts as one of the 12 beauties of Jinling, which is today known as Nanjing. It's one of the 12 main female characters of the novel. There are 2 poems that describe her, the last poem of each poetic cycle, and both of them point directly to what actually happened to her. We will start with the first poem, though both have basically the same image. In the first poem, Jia Baoyu sees an accompanying picture showing a beautiful woman hanging herself from a beam. The poem talks about the meeting of 2 people filled with raw emotion, creating an excess of sexual pleasure. The poem then ends with a prediction of the downfall of the Jia family, which originates with the death of Qin Keqing. Okay, so that part about the 2 emotional types meeting is pretty crazy, because Jia Zhen is clearly not one of these characters full of qing, or what I've translated here as emotion. I personally think that this refers to Jia Baoyu visiting Qin Keqing's bedroom. This is where he has this vision that's the length of chapter 5, where he sees all these poems that talk about what happens to all these girls and so on and so forth. So as part of this dream, he ends up having sexual intercourse with a girl who turns out to be none other than Qin Keqing. This happens despite the fact that in reality she is married to one of his distant cousins. I mean, there'd be a huge scandal if that happened. Now, this is all a dream. It's not really real, of course, but it seems to me that that is the point where the 2 emotional types meet. Anyway, on to the next poem. Now, this poem is called Good Things Must End, and you can probably tell where this is going. This poem is actually pretty clear. The fragrant dust falling from the painted beam refers to Qin Keqing's suicide. It's the exact same image that we saw in the first poem. Then there's all this talk about indulging in romance and emotion being the reason for the breakdown. And the collapse of the family legacy starts with the death of Qin Keqing. It's really clear right here. But of course, in the official novel, Qin Keqing dies from an illness, right? That's the point that people rack their brains around trying to figure out. And this is something that's been going on, by the way, for over 200 years now. So how can you say in one place that she commits suicide when you say in another place that she dies from an illness? So David Hawkes writes commentary about this in the appendix to the first volume of The Story of the Stone, and none of us actually read the appendix, right? Anyway, Hawkes notes that it was clear that she was involved in an incestuous relationship with her father-in-law, though I'm going to be much more direct, and I'm just going to say that she was a rape victim. Hawkes correctly notes that she is supposed to take her own life according to the poems, and yet in all of the manuscripts she winds up dying in a bed of an illness. Now, the obvious conclusion should be that Jia Zhen did what he said, right? He told Cao Xueqin to take out that awful suicide story. Now, maybe Cao Xueqin was a little bit rebellious, and so he let a little trace here and there sort of slip in. At least that's what the traditional interpretation here is. But there's just one problem. The problem is that those poems in chapter 5 are simply too obvious. And the crazy thing is that in the commentary, Jia Zhen actually praises them. In the annotated original manuscripts, there are no comments about how Cao Xueqin should take out the obvious reference to Qin Keqing's suicide. In fact, in Good Things Must End, Jia Zhen praises Cao Xueqin for his clear writing style, which should strike you as a little bit strange at the very least. Here he says that the description of fragrant dust falling from a painted beam is written absolutely exquisitely. And at the end, he talks about how the poem is absolutely perfect and should not be changed by even a single character stroke. So either Jia Zhen is like the biggest idiot ever and is blind to what's going on, or there's something else happening here. And I really think that there's something else happening here. My feeling is that Cao Xueqin likely orchestrated this whole thing. It was probably one of the literary games that he was playing. I think Cao Xueqin, after writing his earlier drafts that were likely destroyed, I think he realized that alluding to an awful death would be much more powerful to his readers than coming out and describing it in full detail. In other words, I do not believe that there's a conspiracy at all. Rather, I believe that the final book is precisely what Cao Xueqin wanted to have published. Now, the reason why I'm such a renegade on this issue and why I'm making all the academics upset is because I've actually read the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature, and yeah, I know that I need a less geeky hobby than this stuff. Anyway, it turns out that the literary critics as far back as the Ming Dynasty, we're talking a century or more before Cao Xueqin was even born, these critics enjoyed reading books with foreshadowing and with echoes of past events. Complex books like The Plum in the Golden Vase and The Story of the Stone were bound to have some unfinished aspects to them, and those were even more entertaining to the careful critics than the books that were perfectly constructed. And of course, there was also this tradition of commentary. This is sort of the classical equivalent of modern-day message boards and YouTube comment sections where people can dissect the work and talk about it to their heart's content. So in other words, what I'm saying with all of this is I think that Cao Xueqin was actually playing directly to his audience and that he knew his audience well. Now think about it this way. If Qin Keqing's suicide and sexual victimhood were described in full detail in this novel, would we have a lot to talk about? We would not, because it's there and you can understand it right away. But because Cao Xueqin decided to hide this stuff because he left a few clues here and there, he created a book that we still talk about well over 250 years later. Now personally, I really believe that all of this was deliberate from the start, and I also believe that the Chengyiban version of Dream of the Red Chamber, or that 1792 version, is the version that is closest to his original intent. But maybe you disagree. Let me know what you think down in the comments.